This is us picking up with Unit 5, the Roaring Twenties and Great Depression. Number 1, isolationism. So that's a big feeling we have after World War One. We're going to have the sense of being isolated. We don't want to get involved in foreign affairs. That's why we don't get involved in League of Nations. The only thing we are going to really do with foreign countries after the war is do what in general? Have what still going? Trade, and that's it, right? But for the most part, we want to be isolated and be uninvolved and untangled in foreign affairs. Nativism is the other big feeling after the war. There's a lot of anti-foreign feelings, which is what nativism is. Remember, it's support of one's people born in its own country. Nativism was a big feeling we had after World War I because we didn't like all the foreigners coming here. We didn't like a lot of the issues of foreigners causing the war. But it also led to what event here in America after the war? Well, a lot of anti-foreign feelings. Red Scare, right? So there's also a big fear of like communist and socialist foreigners coming to America, these radicals who might lead an overthrow of our government, because that just happened in what country? Russia. Bless you. So they didn't want to risk it happening here in America, and there was a lot of fear these revolutions could happen like in Russia or these areas. So the Red Scare, bless you, which is number 3, was this big fear of like foreigners, socialists, radicals, communists in general. It lasts for about a year, 2 years. The Palmer Raids were a result of the Red Scare. The Palmer Raids where the government did searches for communists, socialists, radicals, but they used what evidence? Yeah, basically hearsay or like suspicions. They didn't have hard evidence. So we call that event usually a what? If they don't really have hard evidence when they're doing these searches. Witch hunts, right? So they refer to these events as witch hunts. So the Palmer Raids were witch hunts. Thousands of people got arrested. And some of those foreigners who got arrested on suspicions of like communism, or radicalism, or socialism, or anarchism, what happened to them? What happened to some of those foreigners? And when I just arrested, they're also what? Deported too. So some got deported as a result of the Palmer Raids during that time. So the Red Scare led to a lot of foreign fears and concerns. They were coming to America, ruining America. They might start a revolution here. They might be taking jobs here. All that was a result of those ideas. Which led to number 5, the Quota Acts. The Quota Acts limited what types of Europeans? Eastern and Southern. So I have that down. That the Quota Acts limited Eastern and Southern Europeans from coming to America. They made quotas for them, very small quotas, where only a few thousand would come in each year. Mostly they targeted Italians, Russians, Poles, Slavs, those types. A lot of Catholics, Jews, Orthodox Christians, all those types of Eastern and Southern Europeans. So in general, for this test, I'd be aware of like kind of a timeline or kind of a cause and effect. Fears of nativism after World War I ended led to the Red Scare, right? Which the fear of communists and socialists taking over and anarchists, and fear of foreigners, which led to the Palmer Raids to hunt for these people, to deport them and everything else, and that eventually led to the Quota Acts to help limit foreign immigration from those places. Number 6 is communism. That's where who decides what gets made in the country? People or the state? The state, right? So in communism, the state or the government decides what gets produced. Here in America, who decides here in America? The people do, right? Supply and demand, essentially, not the government. Number 7, the Harlem Renaissance. For the Harlem Renaissance, that's an explosion of what? Kind of culture. Yeah, African American arts, music, literature, singing, all kinds of stuff, right? Happens in Harlem. What event led to a lot of African Americans going up to places like Harlem? The Great Migration, right? So again, cause and effect. Great Migration happens during World War I because African Americans looking for what during World War I? Jobs. So they left the South to go look for jobs. But that led them also to like after the war continuing.
Mr. Harmon?
This is Mr. Southall.
Mr. Southall, can you send me Dwayne Brown, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
But the Great Migration continued after World War I into the 1920s, and they were looking for places to go like Detroit, Boston, Chicago, New York, places to stay. So Harlem becomes this big hub where you have hundreds of thousands of African Americans living there, and it becomes this explosion of culture that takes place in Harlem, New York City. Okay, 8, jazz and the Jazz Age. Jazz music comes from what culture? First of all, what state does it come out of? New Orleans is not a state. Louisiana, so split New Orleans, right? So it comes out of here in New Orleans and Louisiana, but it's made by what culture? African Americans, right? And so what helps to spread jazz music in the teens and 20s? The Great Migration, right? So that makes jazz the dominant form of music in the 1920s, which is why sometimes that 1920s is called the Jazz Age. Who listened to jazz music? You think old white people are listening to jazz music? So mostly what? Younger kids, right? Younger people. So younger people, teens, 20s, 30s, black and white. But it was because young white kids were listening to it, it was an act of what? Rebellion, right? It's an act of rebellion against things they had done their whole life. So it's an act of rebellion, bless you. But it's also a result of the Great Migration. Okay, 10, flappers. 10 is flappers. Flappers were another type of rebellion for who? Young women, right? Young women would dress up as flappers as a way to challenge gender norms. And they actually try to kind of dress less feminine, where they wore dresses that were not so feminine in terms of, like, they were just kind of loose-fitting dresses. They were higher up, kind of closer to the knees. Bob haircuts, right? They did things like hung out with boys and drank and smoked with boys and made it to where they challenged a lot of the gender norms at that time period. But again, we said it's younger women, not like, 60-year-old grannies aren't dressing like flappers typically. All right, switching out of the 20s to the Great Depression, going into number 11, installment and credit plans. That was one of the major reasons why the Great Depression happens, because essentially there was no limitations for people buying things on credit. There was no limitations for people buying things on credit in the 1920s. Thank you. There's no limitations for people buying things in the 1920s, where you could buy virtually anything, cars, furniture, little appliances at a store. You could buy all that on credit, and people racked up debt. So it made the factories overproduce items. But it also led to a lot of people get deeper and deeper in debt. So what happens when the bills start piling up? They can't pay them off, right? And so eventually it makes them go bankrupt, and makes the companies also struggle too, maybe close themselves. That's one of the major reasons why the Great Depression happens. Number 12 and 13 go together. The 18th Amendment created what condition in the country? What? Prohibition. So the 18th Amendment is a result of what era? Fighting for reform. Progressive, right? In the 19aughts and teens. So Prohibition goes into effect in 1920 and lasts for 13 years, until 1933. But as we know, Prohibition, when it's created, is supposed to make society better because you remove the temptation of alcohol and make families and all that better, but does it? Does it lead to more or less problems? More. So one of the biggest results of Prohibition is that it leads to more organized crime in society, like Al Capone, the mafia getting stronger, because they can make a lot of money off of smuggling in alcohol and selling it, right? Al Capone makes like $60 million a year just by smuggling in alcohol back in the 20s. So it leads to more problems than actually getting rid of problems. Buying on the margin is where you do what to be able to buy stock? You get a loan. So it's sort of credit, but more or less a loan, or you're borrowing money to get enough to buy a stock. So you only have some money to put down for a stock, but not the full amount. So you borrow money because you and the loan maker, the banker, whoever, believe, what about that loan? You're going to make profit and you're going to be able to pay it back. It's basically guaranteed, which is why so many people lost a lot of money, and banks lost money when the market crashed. Okay. 15, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Raises or lowers the tariff? Raises it. This was one of the actions by Hoover and the Republican Congress. It raised the tariff, the highest that it had ever been. So it happens as one of the early responses to the Great Depression. Does it make the Great Depression worse or better? Worse. Because it makes trade internationally flow more or stop. Stop. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff makes international trade stop more and not flow as easily as before. And it makes international it makes the Great Depression worse for our country and international relations worse too. New Deal programs. So there's some you need to be aware of for this test. It's mostly the major ones, and you just went through all this not long ago. I'll give you the major ones you need to be aware of in general. You need to be aware of AAA. AAA was for farmers, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. What I would just do is write the initials down for now and go back and restudy them this week. But AAA is Agricultural Adjustment Act, pays the farmers to farm less. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, created jobs, created electricity for Tennessee Valley area. Also produced electricity, fertilizer, all that. FDIC insured money in banks up to $5,000. So FDIC insured money in banks up to $5,000. The job program that allowed young men to work only was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. It mostly focused on environmental concerns like planting trees, doing works in national parks, those areas. Let's see what else. SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission.
Student teachers, pardon interruption. Students, we have a little Christmas gift for you, and so teachers at this time, I want you to send.
We'll stop.